By the time the man in the $1,000 boots was finished, the silence in the field was so total, you could hear the brittle whisper of a single paper napkin lifting off a picnic table in the wind. He had paid $300,000 for a single rusted tractor that he did not even own, and the laughter that had filled the auction yard a year prior had curdled into a thick, unswallowable knot of public humiliation. But they were all laughing when Wyatt Carver first arrived, especially the man in the expensive boots. They laughed at his truck, a tired Ford with a fender the color of a faded bruise. They laughed at the coffee tin he carried his money in. And they laughed most of all at the object of his attention, a skeletal Farmall Model H, sitting defeated in the junk row, its red paint peeling back from the rusted metal like a sunburned lip. It was worth $50, they said. Scrap value, at best. What none of them knew, what only Wyatt and the ghost of his grandfather understood, was that welded crudely into the tractor's main frame, rail was not just a clumsy repair, but a legal instrument of such profound power that it would rewrite the ownership of 2,000 acres of prime North American farmland. The laughter stopped, but not until the trap, set 50 years before by a desperate farmer and sprung by his quiet apprentice, had closed for good. The air at the Red River Valley annual implement auction was a thick cocktail of dust, diesel exhaust, and cheap coffee. It was a place of hard truths and harder men, a sprawling purgatory for the machinery that had plowed the furrows and harvested the grain of a dozen counties. Here, tractors were not just machines, they were biographies written in steel, their stories told in the score marks on a cylinder wall, the sag of a drawbar, the particular whine of a gear that had been meshing with its partner for half a century. Men with faces like old leather and eyes that could gauge the health of a cornstalk from 100 yards away moved through the rows of equipment with a slow, deliberate shuffle. They were a tribe, and they knew their own. They spoke a language of horsepower and hydraulic pressures, of PTO shafts and gear ratios, a laconic poetry of the practical. Into this world, Wyatt Carver arrived like a misplaced comma in a perfectly constructed sentence. He was 22, but a certain weariness around his eyes made him look both younger and older at the same time. He was tall and lanky, with the kind of frame that seemed assembled from parts that did not quite fit, all elbows and knees. His hair was the color of dried straw, and it fell across his forehead in a way that suggested he cut it himself, probably with the same shears he used for baling twine. His clothes were worn but meticulously clean. A pair of denim trousers faded to the color of a summer sky at the knees, a plaid shirt with a neatly stitched repair on the cuff, and work boots that had been oiled and cared for to within an inch of their lives. They were his grandfather's boots. He parked his truck, a 1986 Ford F-150, whose original blue paint was a distant memory, at the far edge of the dusty lot, away from the gleaming new Silverados and Rams that belonged to the more prosperous farmers and dealers. He killed the engine, and the truck sighed, a puff of blue smoke exhaling from its tailpipe like a final weary word. For a moment, Wyatt sat in the cab, the cracked vinyl of the bench seat cool against his back. He looked at his hands on the steering wheel. They were long-fingered and slender, but the knuckles were scraped and the nails were permanently underlined with grease, a testament to a life spent in communion with stubborn metal. He took a deep breath, the scent of the auction yard filling his lungs. It was the smell of his childhood, the smell of his grandfather's workshop, the smell of home. He reached over and picked up 2 items from the passenger seat. The first was a large metal coffee tin, the old kind, with a pry-off lid. It was heavy, filled with the cash he had saved from 2 years of odd jobs, fixing neighbors' lawnmowers, rebuilding carburetors, sharpening chainsaw blades. It was not a lot of money, not in this world of $10,000 balers and $100,000 combines, but it was everything he had. The second item was a small, worn leather notebook, its cover softened to the texture of a glove. It was held shut by a brittle rubber band. Inside its pages were his grandfather's words, transcribed in Wyatt's own neat, blocky handwriting, a Bible of mechanical wisdom and moral clarity. As he slid out of the truck, the coffee tin clutched in one hand and the notebook in the other, he felt the eyes on him. A pair of older farmers, leaning against the fender of a new John Deere, stopped their conversation and watched him pass. One of them nudged the other, a small, almost imperceptible gesture that spoke volumes. Their expressions were not unkind, but they were dismissive, the look of seasoned professionals observing an amateur who had wandered into the wrong arena. Wyatt felt the familiar heat rise in his cheeks, but he pushed it down. He had learned from his grandfather that the opinions of others were like the weather. You had to be aware of them, but you couldn't let them stop you from getting the work done. He walked past the main rows, past the gleaming, monstrous combines that looked more like spaceships than farm equipment, their glass cabs winking in the morning sun. He ignored the rows of mid-sized tractors, the workhorses of the modern farm, their tires taller than he was. He had a destination. He was heading for the place the auction regulars called the Boneyard. It was a section at the very back of the lot, a forlorn collection of the broken, the obsolete, and the forgotten. Here, the grass grew a little taller, and the rust was a deeper, more permanent shade of orange. It was where machines came to die, their useful lives over, waiting to be picked apart for a spare gear or a usable rim before being hauled away for scrap. And there it was. It was a Farmall Model H, built sometime in the late 1940s. To the casual observer, it was a wreck. One of the huge rear tires was flat, the rubber cracked and split like an old gourd. The other listed sadly to one side. The engine was exposed to the elements, its manifold a filigree of rust. The steering wheel was a naked metal ring, the black plastic having long since crumbled away. Its iconic red paint was almost gone, surviving only in protected patches under the fuel tank and along the belly, like the last stubborn patches of snow in a spring field. It looked less like a tractor and more like the idea of a tractor, a memory sketched in rust. The other men in the boneyard, scavengers looking for cheap parts, gave it no more than a passing glance. It was too far gone. Even as a parts machine, it was a losing proposition. The engine was likely seized, the transmission probably full of water, but Wyatt approached it with a reverence that was jarring in its intensity. He didn't see a wreck. He saw a puzzle. He saw a story. He set the coffee tin down carefully in the tall grass. He opened his notebook, its pages fluttering in the breeze. He ran his hand over the cold, pitted metal of the fender, his fingertips tracing the ghost of a decal. He walked around the machine slowly, his eyes scanning every inch. He was not looking at the big, obvious problems. He was reading the small details. He noted the way the drawbar was worn, the specific pattern of scrapes suggesting it had spent most of its life pulling a plow, not a wagon. He saw the faint, almost invisible outline of a custom-welded bracket on the side, long since removed, where a farmer might have mounted a homemade tool. Then, he knelt down, his knees sinking into the damp earth. He looked at the right side frame rail, the thick C-channel of steel that formed the tractor's spine. About halfway down its length was a weld. It was an ugly thing, a clumsy, thick bead that bulged out from the frame. It was not a factory weld. It was a repair, and a crude one at that, done by someone with more determination than skill. To any other mechanic, it was a sign of a critical weakness, a fracture in the machine's very skeleton that had been crudely patched. It was a deal-breaker, the final nail in the coffin of a worthless machine. Wyatt reached out and laid his palm flat against it. The metal was cold. He closed his eyes, just as his grandfather had taught him. "Listen to the metal," the old man used to say. "It tells the truth." He felt the rough texture of the weld bead under his palm. He ran his fingers along its edges. It was too thick. It was too wide. It was structurally nonsensical. It didn't follow the clean, logical lines of a proper frame repair. It was a box. A clumsy, lumpy, welded-on steel box disguised as a patch. A shadow fell over him. "Finding any treasures in the junkyard, son?" Wyatt opened his eyes. Standing over him was a man who seemed to have been cut from a different cloth than everyone else at the auction. He was in his late 40s, his face smooth and tanned, not from the sun and wind, but from a golf course or a vacation. He wore a crisp white shirt, a pair of dark, expensive-looking jeans, and a pair of polished leather boots that had clearly never stepped in anything more offensive than a puddle in a paved parking lot. His smile was wide and practiced, but it didn't reach his eyes. His eyes were cold and sharp, the eyes of a predator scanning for weakness. This was Clark Sterling. Wyatt knew of him. Everyone in the valley knew of him. He was the face of AgriCorp, the massive agricultural conglomerate that had been buying up family farms and consolidating them into vast, faceless operations. He was the man who spoke of synergies and efficiencies while putting generations of farmers out of business. Wyatt slowly got to his feet, brushing the dirt from his knees. He didn't say anything. Sterling's eyes flicked from Wyatt's face down to the rusted tractor, then back. A small, condescending smirk played on his lips. A Farmall H. My grandfather had one of these. Good little tractor in its day. He gestured vaguely at the wreck. This one, though, its day is long past. He saw the open notebook in Wyatt's hand, and his smirk widened. Doing some research? Let me save you the trouble. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a confidential, patronizing tone. The engine seized. You can tell by the rust pattern on the spark plugs. Transmission's shot, probably cracked the case when the rear axle went. See how it's listing? That's a fatal flaw. He tapped a polished boot against the good rear tire. You're looking at maybe 500 pounds of cast iron you can sell for scrap. The rest is junk. Wyatt remained silent, his expression unreadable. He simply looked at Sterling, his gaze steady. Sterling seemed to take the silence as a sign of youthful ignorance, of being properly intimidated. He clapped Wyatt on the shoulder, a gesture that was meant to seem friendly but felt more like a claim of dominance. Look, son, I know what it's like. You see these old machines and you get sentimental. You think about the good old days. He looked around the boneyard with a theatrical sigh. But you can't build a future on sentiment. That's a parts tractor at best. Leave the real business to the men who understand it. A few other men who had been browsing nearby had stopped to listen. One of them, a heavy-set dealer in a greasy cap, let out a short, sharp chuckle. Sterling's smile broadened. He had an audience. He had established the social order. He was the expert, the man of substance. Wyatt was the sentimental boy, the fool. Wyatt didn't flinch. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He simply gave a small, almost imperceptible nod and looked back down at the tractor, at the clumsy weld on the frame. His public humiliation was complete. But as Sterling walked away, confident and self-satisfied, Wyatt allowed himself the smallest of smiles. Because Sterling was right about one thing. He had said, "Leave the real business to the men who understand it." And Wyatt understood. He understood in a way that Sterling, with all his money and all his power, could never possibly comprehend. The real business had nothing to do with a seized engine or a cracked transmission. The real business was hidden in plain sight, sealed in a box of steel, waiting for someone who knew the story. The workshop had a smell that Wyatt could conjure in his mind with perfect clarity, even years after it was gone. It was a complex symphony of scents, the sharp, metallic tang of cold steel, the sweet, heavy perfume of gear oil, the dusty aroma of old wood, the faint, acrid ghost of a welding arc, and underneath it all, the earthy smell of the black dirt that his grandfather, Samuel Carver, would track in on his boots. The shop was not a building. It was a sanctuary. It was a library where the books were made of iron and the stories were told in degrees of wear. Samuel Carver was a man carved from the same hard, unyielding material as the land he farmed. He was tall and spare, with a face full of lines that seemed to follow the contours of a topographical map. His hands were his most remarkable feature. They were huge, gnarled things, the skin as tough as old harness leather, yet they could move with a surgeon's delicacy. He could diagnose an engine's ailment by the rhythm of its miss, or tell the quality of a piece of steel by the sound it made when he tapped it with a ball-peen hammer. He was a mechanic, but he was also a philosopher. His medium was machinery, but his subject was truth. Wyatt spent his childhood as his grandfather's shadow. While other boys were playing baseball, Wyatt was learning to read the language of a spark plug. A white, blistered insulator meant the engine was running too lean. A black, sooty deposit meant it was running too rich. A clean tan color was the sign of a healthy, happy engine. "Everything leaves a trail," Samuel would say, his voice a low rumble. "You just have to learn how to read the signs. People will lie to you, Wyatt. They'll lie to themselves. But the metal, The metal never lies. The education was relentless and practical. It began with cleaning parts. For months, Wyatt's only job was to sit with a bucket of solvent and a set of brushes, scrubbing years of grease and grime from gears, pistons, and housings. It was tedious, frustrating work. But one day, as he was cleaning a large bull gear from a tractor's final drive, his grandfather stopped him. "Hold on," Samuel said. He pointed with a thick finger at one of the gear teeth. "See that? Right there on the edge." Wyatt squinted. He saw a tiny, almost invisible line, a hairline fracture in the hardened steel. "That's a spall," Samuel explained. "It's starting to fail. If you hadn't cleaned it perfectly, we'd have never seen it. We'd have put it back in, and in 100 hours, it would have let go, taken out the whole rear end. Cost a man a fortune." Cleaning isn't just about making things look nice. It's about seeing what's really there. From cleaning, he graduated to measuring. He learned to use a micrometer, its delicate clicks as he turned the thimble a kind of secret code. He spent a whole summer measuring the cylinder bores of a worn-out engine block, recording the numbers in a notebook. He measured the top, middle, and bottom of each cylinder, both parallel and perpendicular to the crankshaft. His grandfather then showed him how to interpret the numbers, how the pattern of wear could tell him if the engine had been overheated, if it had been run low on oil, or if it had simply lived a long, hard life. It was an autopsy in numbers. The centerpiece of Samuel's workshop and of Wyatt's education was a long wooden workbench that ran the entire length of one wall. Above it, organized with a jeweler's precision, were his grandfather's tools. They were not new or shiny. They were old, many of them heirlooms from his own father. The wooden handles of the screwdrivers were dark, with the patina of sweat and oil, worn smooth to fit his grandfather's grip perfectly. The wrenches were heavy, forged steel, their jaws unsprung from a lifetime of careful use. Samuel had taught him that a good mechanic respected his tools. "Never use a wrench as a hammer," he'd say. "Never use a screwdriver as a pry bar. Every tool has its purpose. Use it for what it was made for, and it will serve you well." But the true heart of the workshop was not the tools, but the binders. On a sturdy shelf above the workbench sat a row of 27 identical 3-ring binders. They were black, with simple white labels on the spine: Farmall H, John Deere B, Alice Chalmers WD-45, and so on. Inside these binders was the collected wisdom of Samuel Carver. They were not just service manuals, they were diaries. For every major repair he had ever done, Samuel had made a page. He would staple the invoice for the parts to the top. He would write down the symptoms, his diagnosis, the steps he took to make the repair, and most importantly, his observations. "Replaced head gasket on Miller's 51 John Deere A," one entry read. "Symptoms: water and oil. Found gasket failed at cylinder 2. Noticed unusual scoring on cylinder wall. Checked head for warp. Found it was low by .004 inches at the center. Milled head flat. Note: Miller admitted to running it hot last summer. This is the second time. Told him if he does it again, he'll crack the block for sure. A man who won't listen to his machine will end up paying for its silence." Wyatt spent countless hours reading those binders. They were better than any book. They were a record of a life lived in service to a principle, the principle that every problem had a root cause, and that a man's job was to find it, not just to patch the symptom. It was a philosophy that applied to more than just machines. The formative trauma of Wyatt's life came not with a bang, but with the quiet, relentless turning of a screw. When Wyatt was 16, the rain stopped. The sky turned a metallic, unforgiving blue, and the corn in the fields began to wither. The ponds dried up, their muddy bottoms cracking into a mosaic of despair. It was a bad year, followed by another. Samuel, like many of his neighbors, had taken out a loan from a large agricultural bank to upgrade his equipment a few years prior. The bank was a subsidiary of Agricorp. At first, the letters were friendly. Then they became firm. Then they became threatening. Samuel had never missed a payment in his life, but with 2 years of failed crops, the money simply wasn't there. He went to the bank. He spoke to a young man in a suit, a man who looked at Samuel's calloused hands with a faint, clinical distaste. Samuel explained the situation. He asked for an extension, for a deferment. He had a lifetime of good credit, of being a pillar of the community. He was Samuel Carver. His word was his bond. The young man smiled, a thin, bloodless smile. "I understand, Mr. Carver," he said, though his eyes showed no understanding at all. "But the terms of the loan are quite clear. We are not in the business of sentiment. We are in the business of agriculture." 2 months later, the foreclosure notice arrived. It was posted on the front door of the farmhouse where Samuel had been born. The auction was held on a cold, windswept day in November. Wyatt stood beside his grandfather as their lives were sold off, piece by piece. The tractors, the plows, the baler. Other farmers bought them, their faces grim. They didn't want to do it, but it was a matter of survival. The final lot was the farm itself, the land his family had worked for 3 generations. It was bought by a numbered company. The man who signed the papers was Clark Sterling. Samuel Carver did not say a word through the entire ordeal. He stood straight and tall, his face a mask of stone. But Wyatt, standing beside him, could feel the tremors running through the old man's body. They lost everything. The house, the land, the workshop. The only things Samuel was allowed to keep were his personal tools and the black binders. They moved into a small rented house in the nearby town. The workshop was gone, but Samuel still had his tools. He set them up in the garage, but it wasn't the same. The light was wrong. The smell was wrong. A part of him had died at that auction, the part that was rooted in the black soil of his farm. He grew quiet and distant. He would sit for hours, staring out the window, his big, capable hands lying still in his lap. 6 months after the foreclosure, Samuel Carver passed away in his sleep. The doctor said it was his heart. But Wyatt knew the truth. He had died of a broken spirit. He had died because the world he understood, a world of handshakes and honest work, had been replaced by a world of contracts and leveraged assets. After the funeral, Wyatt went into the garage. The air was cold and still. The tools were neatly in their places, waiting for a hand that would never hold them again. The black binders were stacked on the bench. Wyatt picked one up. It was the one labeled Farmall H. He opened it. Tucked inside the front cover was a folded, yellowed piece of paper. It was a copy of a quitclaim deed, dated 1974. He had seen it before. One rainy afternoon, years ago, his grandfather had shown it to him. He had pulled this very binder from the shelf. "I want to tell you a story," Samuel had said, "a story about a man named John Hemlock." Hemlock had been Samuel's neighbor, a smart, wiry old farmer who had a deep distrust of banks and governments. In the early 70s, during another brutal drought, Hemlock found himself in the same position Samuel would later face. He was about to lose his land, a sprawling 2,000-acre tract that had been in his family since the homesteading days. But Hemlock was clever. He knew there was talk of oil and gas exploration in the region. He went to the bank, Samuel had explained, his finger tracing the lines of legal text on the deed. He told them he was ready to sign the land over, but he had one condition. He wanted to keep his old tractor, a 48 Farmall H. The bankers laughed. It was a piece of junk. They agreed, happy to get the land without a fight. Samuel had then pulled out another document, a copy of the conveyance agreement. "But look here," he said, pointing to a bizarre, lengthy addendum. Hemlock had a cousin who was a sharp lawyer. They drew this up. It severs the mineral rights from the surface rights. That's not uncommon. But they did something unique. They didn't assign the mineral rights to Hemlock himself or to a company. They legally defined the mineral rights as chattel, as a piece of personal property, and then physically and legally affixed that property to the tractor. Wyatt, a boy of 14 at the time, had been confused. They attached the oil rights to the tractor? Exactly. Samuel had rumbled, a rare smile touching his lips. The deed specifies that ownership of the mineral rights for the entire 2,000-acre parcel is held by the physical chassis of the Farmall Model H tractor, serial number FBH-278841. It's brilliant in its own crazy way. As long as the tractor itself exists, whoever owns the tractor owns the mineral rights. The bankers never read the fine print. They just saw the land. They didn't care about some old farmer's rusty toy. What happened to it? Wyatt had asked. Hemlock sold the farm. He moved away. He took the tractor with him, but he fell on hard times. He had to sell it. It passed through a few hands. Then, about 20 years ago, I found it at an auction, just like this one. I recognized it from the serial number. Hemlock had told me what he'd done, told me to keep an eye out for it. I bought it. Not for the rights, mind you. I just wanted to make sure it was safe. Samuel had then led Wyatt out to the back of the workshop, to the old Farmall H sitting under a tarp. It was the same one. He had knelt down and pointed to the clumsy weld on the frame. After he sold the land, Hemlock got paranoid. He thought someone might try to steal the tractor or claim the chassis number plate wasn't original, so he did this. He rapped his knuckles on the weld. It made a dull, solid thud. He took the original notarized conveyance document, sealed it in a waterproof copper tube, and had a welder friend fuse it right into the frame. He made the document a physical, inseparable part of the machine, the ultimate proof. Wyatt, standing in the cold silence of the garage, holding the yellowed copy of the deed, finally understood. His grandfather hadn't just left him tools and binders. He had left him a key. He had left him a weapon forged from integrity, knowledge, and a deep understanding of the difference between what something costs and what it is truly worth. He had left him the story of the Farmall H, and he had left him a mission. It wasn't about revenge, not exactly. It was about justice. It was about proving that the world of Samuel Carver, the world of truth in metal, could still win against the world of Clark Sterling, the world of lies in fine print. He folded the paper, tucked it back into the binder, and closed the cover. He knew what he had to do. He had to wait. He had to learn. And then he had to go to the auction. The auctioneer, a man named Bob Henderson, whose voice was a gravelly roar that could cut through the noise of a dozen running engines, finally got to the boneyard. His pace was quick now, his words clipped. This was the end of the day, the part of the sale he just wanted to get through. He gestured with a dismissive wave at the line of decrepit machinery. All right, folks, you know the deal back here. Everything's sold as is, where is. No guarantees, no warranties, no crying. Lot 347, Farmall H. What you see is what you get. Looks like she's seen better days. Good for parts, maybe a lawn ornament. Who'll give me $100 for it? $100 to start? Silence. The only sound was the wind whistling through the rusted grill of a nearby combine. The dealers and farmers who had lingered were looking for specific parts, and this tractor offered nothing of obvious value. $100, boys? The tires are probably worth that in scrap rubber. 75? Who'll give me 75? Henderson's eyes scanned the small, unimpressed crowd. He was met with blank stares and the occasional shake of a head. From the back of the group, a quiet voice said, $50. Henderson's eyes found Wyatt. He was standing by himself, the coffee tin held at his side. A few people turned to look. A low murmur went through the crowd, a mixture of amusement and pity. Clark Sterling, who had been chatting with a well-known land developer near the front, turned his head, a look of theatrical disbelief on his face. $50, Henderson boomed, seizing on the only sign of life. I got $50 from the young man in the back. It's a start, folks. Now who'll give me 60? $60, it's only money. Sterling let out a loud, deliberate laugh. It wasn't a friendly chuckle. It was a performance. It was a sound designed to mock, to belittle. Let the boy have his toy, Bob, he called out, his voice carrying easily across the lot. He's been staring at it all day. Must be in love. The crowd chuckled along with him. The social pressure was immense. Anyone who bid against Wyatt now would be participating in the joke, overpaying for a piece of scrap just to take it from a sentimental kid. The bidding was effectively dead. Henderson, a professional who just wanted to close the lot, knew it. He sighed. $50 once, he called out, his voice losing its energy. $50 twice. He looked around one last time, meeting only the smug, smiling face of Clark Sterling. He shrugged, a gesture that said, "It's your funeral, kid." Sold! The crack of his gavel was like a starter pistol. For $50, to the young man with more hope than sense. Wyatt felt a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled his knees. He had done it. Step one was complete. Step one. He walked forward, his face a mask of calm, ignoring the smirks and the sideways glances. He went to the clerk's trailer, a small, stuffy office on wheels. He placed the coffee tin on the counter and pried open the lid. He counted out $50 in a mixture of worn 5s and 10s. The clerk, a woman with tired eyes, took the money without comment and handed him a carbon copy receipt. Wyatt took the small slip of paper and folded it carefully, tucking it into the front pocket of his shirt. This flimsy piece of paper was now a document of immense significance. It was the bill of sale. It was the title transfer. It was the proof of ownership. He spent the next hour arranging for a flatbed tow truck from a friend in town. As he was hooking the winch cable to the front axle of the Farmall, a shadow fell over him again. It was Sterling. "Well, you got your prize," Sterling said. His tone was no longer openly mocking. It was laced with a new, sharper emotion, curiosity. The fact that Wyatt had gone through with it, that he was actually paying to have the wreck hauled away, had piqued his predatory interest. A fool was one thing. A fool with a plan was another. "Look, kid," Sterling said, getting straight to the point. "I don't know what you think you've found here, but let's be realistic. That thing is never going to run again." He pulled a thick money clip from his pocket, peeling off a crisp $100 bill. "Here, I'll give you $100 for it. Double your money. You walk away with a $50 profit for a few hours of your time. A good day's work." Wyatt looked from the $100 bill to Sterling's face. He saw the calculation in the man's eyes. This wasn't a generous offer. It was a probe. It was an attempt to measure Wyatt's motives. "No, thank you," Wyatt said quietly. Sterling's smile tightened. "All right. You're a tough negotiator. I respect that." He peeled off 4 more bills. $500. Right here, right now. Cash. That's a 10-fold return on your investment. In any other business, they'd call you a genius. "It's not for sale," Wyatt said, his voice polite but firm. Sterling's facade of friendliness began to crack. A flicker of irritation crossed his face. He couldn't process the refusal. In his world, everything had a price. Every man had a number. Refusing a generous profit on a worthless asset was not just bad business. It was illogical. It was an insult. $1,000, Sterling said, his voice flat and cold. "That's my final offer. $1,000 for a $50 piece of junk. Take it or leave it. But I'll tell you this, son. Whatever little secret you think you've got, it's not worth more than that. I guarantee it." Wyatt straightened up from his work. He looked Sterling directly in the eye. His own gaze was clear and unwavering. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Sterling," he said, his voice still quiet, but now with an edge of steel that hadn't been there before. "But like I said, it's not for sale." He turned back to the tractor, giving the winch cable a final check. The tow truck driver gave him a thumbs up. The winch began to groan, and the old Farmall, its flat tire scraping a long, mournful line in the dirt, began its slow journey onto the flatbed. Its final journey home. Sterling stood there for a long time, watching the truck pull away. The money was still in his hand. The $1,000 felt like an insult now, a testament to his own failure to understand. He had been dismissed. He, Clark Sterling, had been dismissed by a boy in rags with a $50 tractor. The amusement was gone, replaced by a cold, simmering anger. He turned to one of his assistants, a young, ambitious man who had been hovering nearby. "Find out who that kid is," Sterling hissed, his voice low and dangerous. "Find out where he lives. Find out what he's up to. I want to know everything. He thinks he's clever. We'll see how clever he is when he's got the full weight of Agricorp on his back. Everyone has a price, and if they don't, they have a breaking point. Find it." The trap had been baited. The target had taken it. Now the real conflict, the long, slow war of attrition, was about to begin. The initial victory was not the tractor itself, but the mystification of his enemy. Wyatt knew that Sterling's greatest weakness was his arrogance, his belief that anything he couldn't understand must be worthless. And Wyatt was about to bank his entire future on that arrogance. Wyatt brought the Farmall H back to the small garage behind the house he rented. It was the same garage his grandfather had used in his final months, and it still felt haunted by his presence. The tools were there, the binders were there, but the spirit was Wyatt's alone now. He carefully unloaded the tractor, positioning it in the center of the concrete floor. It looked even more forlorn under the bare fluorescent lights of the garage, a patient on an operating table. His first instinct was to take a cutting torch and go straight for the welded box on the frame, to liberate the copper tube, to hold the proof in his hands. But his grandfather's voice echoed in his mind. Patience, Wyatt. Haste is the enemy of truth. Do the work. Do all of it. He knew that possessing the document was not enough. He had to build a fortress of legality and process around it, a fortress so unassailable that even a giant like Agricorp couldn't breach it. The document was the keystone, but the arch had not yet been built. So he covered the Farmall with a heavy canvas tarp, concealing it from prying eyes. And he began the second phase of his grandfather's plan. He started to build a life. He put a small hand-painted sign at the end of his driveway. Carver Repair. Old Iron Welcome. He took out a small ad in the local weekly paper. He started his own business, using his grandfather's tools and his grandfather's binders. His first customers were the old-timers, men in their 70s and 80s who still ran the machines of their youth. They came to him with their sputtering John Deere A's and their leaky Alice Chalmers G's. They were men who had been turned away by the big shiny Agricorp service center that had opened on the edge of town. The mechanics there, young men trained on laptops and diagnostic software, didn't know what to do with a tractor that didn't have a computer port. They would look at the old machines with contempt, quote an outrageous price for a repair, and then try to sell the old farmer a new financed piece of equipment. Wyatt was different. When an old farmer brought him a sick tractor, Wyatt would listen. He would listen to the farmer's description of the problem, nodding patiently. Then he would listen to the machine itself, his head cocked, his eyes closed. He would pull the relevant binder from his shelf and look up the machine's history, if his grandfather had ever worked on it. He charged fair prices, sometimes bartering for a cord of firewood or a side of beef. He guaranteed his work, not with a printed warranty, but with a handshake. His reputation began to grow, spreading not through advertising, but through conversations over coffee at the local diner and nods of respect at the feed store. Meanwhile, Clark Sterling and Agricorp were not idle. Sterling's initial curiosity had hardened into a predatory obsession. He had his men investigate Wyatt. They reported back that he was just a small-time backyard mechanic. The grandson of the farmer Agricorp had foreclosed on years ago. They told him about Wyatt's interest in the old Hemlock property. This confirmed Sterling's suspicion that the secret of the tractor was related to land. He assumed Wyatt had found an old unrecorded deed to a small forgotten parcel or perhaps an easement. A nuisance, but nothing more. Sterling's strategy was to squeeze Wyatt from all sides. The new Agricorp Service Center began offering legacy equipment specials, drastically undercutting Wyatt's prices. They ran ads on the local radio station. "Don't trust your farm's future to a part-time hobbyist," the announcer's smooth voice would say. "Come to the professionals at Agricorp." They started buying up the small parcels of land surrounding Wyatt's rented property, their surveyors planting stakes that seemed to march closer and closer every week. They even contacted the owner of Wyatt's rental house, making a generous offer to buy it out from under him. The owner, a friend of his grandfather's, refused. But the message was clear. We can surround you, we can isolate you, we can erase you. The pressure mounted. Wyatt's business slowed. Some of his customers, tempted by the low prices, took their machines to Agricorp. He was working longer hours for less money, the weight of his secret a constant heavy presence. It was during this time that he faced his crucible. A farmer named Bill Jensen, a man who had been one of Wyatt's most loyal customers, brought in his combine. It was the heart of harvest season, and the machine had developed a complex hydraulic problem. The header wouldn't stay level. Wyatt, tired and stressed, made a quick diagnosis. He thought it was a faulty valve. He spent a day replacing it, bled the system, and sent Jensen on his way. The next afternoon, Jensen was back, his face a thundercloud. The combine was down again, the same problem. He had lost a full day of harvesting, and now a storm was rolling in. "I trusted you, Wyatt," he yelled, his voice raw with anger and panic. "You're no better than those crooks at Agricorp. You said you fixed it." Wyatt felt a cold dread wash over him. He had been so sure. He had taken a shortcut. He hadn't followed his grandfather's primary rule: go all the way to the bottom of the problem. He had treated the symptom, not the root cause. He looked at Bill Jensen, a good man whose livelihood was now at risk because of his mistake, and he felt the full weight of his failure. "You're right, Bill," Wyatt said, his voice barely a whisper. "I messed up. There's no excuse." He didn't try to defend himself. He didn't make promises. He just said, "Let's get it in the shop. I'll make it right." He worked for 24 hours straight, fueled by black coffee and a burning sense of shame. He tore the entire hydraulic system apart. He traced every line, checked every seal. And finally, deep in the guts of the machine, he found it. A tiny internal leak in a hydraulic cylinder, so small it would only manifest after the system had been running under load for a few hours. A leak his initial hasty diagnosis had missed. He didn't have the part. The Agricorp Center was closed. He called a friend who ran a salvage yard 3 counties over. The friend had one. Wyatt drove through the night, through the driving rain of the storm that was now lashing the valley, to get it. By dawn, the combine was running. It was perfect. Wyatt tested it for 2 hours under full load until he was absolutely certain. When Bill Jensen arrived, haggard and expecting the worst, he found his machine cleaned, repaired, and ready to go. "How much do I owe you?" Jensen asked, his voice gruff, avoiding eye contact. "You don't owe me anything," Wyatt said. He handed Jensen an envelope. Inside was the money Jensen had paid him for the initial failed repair. "I cost you a day of harvest. That's on me. This repair and the first one are on the house. I'm sorry, Bill." Jensen stood there for a moment, stunned into silence. He looked at Wyatt, at the deep dark circles under his eyes, at the grease stains on his face. He looked at the combine, humming smoothly. He finally nodded, a slow, deliberate gesture of profound respect. He didn't say thank you. He didn't have to. He just shook Wyatt's hand, his grip firm and strong. The story of what Wyatt had done spread through the valley faster than a wildfire. The farmers who had been tempted by Agricorp's discounts came back. They understood. A low price was one thing. Integrity, real accountability, was another. Wyatt's failure and his response to it had become the single greatest advertisement for his character. He had lost money on the job, but he had earned something far more valuable: unshakable trust. That night, before he fell into an exhausted sleep, he took out his notebook and created a new page. At the top, he wrote, "Rule number 17. A quick diagnosis is a false diagnosis. Never stop at the first answer. Go all the way to the bottom." While Wyatt was building his reputation, he was also building his case. One day a week he would close the shop. He would drive his old Ford to the county courthouse. It was a stately, quiet building with floors that creaked and a smell of old paper and floor wax. He spent hours in the records room, a dusty basement archive managed by a stern but helpful woman named Mrs. Gable. He started with the original Hemlock deed. He had his grandfather's copy, but he needed a certified original. He found it, filed away in a massive leather-bound book from 1974. He paid for a certified copy, the official stamp, a small but powerful victory. Then, he began to trace the ownership of the land itself. He followed the chain of title, from Hemlock to the bank, from the bank to a series of holding companies, and finally to Agricorp. He confirmed that Sterling's company was indeed the current surface owner of the entire 2,000-acre tract. Then he moved to the tax records. This was the most crucial part. Had anyone ever paid taxes on the severed mineral rights? If they had been taxed as real property and Agricorp had paid those taxes, his claim could be in jeopardy. He spent weeks poring over microfilm, his eyes burning from the dim green light of the reader. He found what he was looking for, or rather, what he was not looking for. The county had never assessed the mineral rights as separate real estate. Because the original conveyance had defined them as chattel, as personal property, they had fallen through a legal crack. They had never been on the tax rolls. Sterling's men, who were still keeping a casual eye on Wyatt, reported his visits to the courthouse. Sterling was pleased. "The kid's chasing a paper ghost," he told his legal team. "He thinks he's found a loophole, a forgotten claim. Let him. He's a fly buzzing against a window. He'll tire himself out eventually." Sterling, confident that he had Wyatt pinned down, accelerated his own plans. He finalized the purchase of the last few parcels of the old Hemlock land. He now owned the entire surface, a contiguous block of prime farmland. He began planning a major PR event to celebrate the consolidation, a big Farmer Appreciation Day, to showcase AgriCorp's dominance and its supposed commitment to the community. The trap was almost set. Wyatt had built the walls of his fortress. He had the certified deed. He had the tax records confirming the rights had never been taxed as land. He had the bill of sale for the tractor, the vessel of ownership. All he needed now was for his enemy to walk into the center of the kill zone. And Sterling, blinded by his own arrogance, was sending out engraved invitations to the event. The Farmer Appreciation Day was pure Clark Sterling. It was held in a large, freshly mown hayfield that had, until recently, belonged to a family named Peterson. A massive white tent had been erected, under which caterers in crisp uniforms served up barbecue and beer. A small stage was set up at one end, with a banner that read, "AgriCorp, sowing the seeds of tomorrow's harvest." The sun was bright. The sky was a deep, cloudless blue. It was a perfect day for a public execution. Sterling was in his element, moving through the crowd of local farmers with his practiced smile and firm handshake. He knew most of them by name, a trick he had learned from a book on corporate leadership. He was a wolf hosting a party for the sheep, and he was enjoying every moment of it. He had consolidated the Hemlock tract. He had marginalized the small-time mechanic who had defied him. Today was his victory lap. Wyatt arrived late. He parked his old truck down the road and walked in. He wore the same clean but worn clothes he always did. He didn't get a plate of food. He didn't grab a beer. He just stood at the very back of the crowd, near the edge of the tent, a silent, watchful presence. Several farmers saw him and gave him quiet nods of acknowledgement. Bill Jensen, the man whose combine Wyatt had fixed, came over and stood with him. They didn't speak. They just stood together. Finally, the time came for the main event. Bob Henderson, the auctioneer, had been hired to act as the master of ceremonies. He introduced Sterling with a flourish, calling him a true visionary of modern agriculture. Sterling took the stage to polite applause. He beamed, soaking in the moment. He spoke for 20 minutes, his voice smooth and confident, filled with buzzwords like synergy, paradigm shift, and vertical integration. He was painting a picture of a bright future, a future where farming was no longer a struggle, but a clean, efficient business managed by experts like himself. Then, his eyes found Wyatt, standing at the back of the crowd. A cruel, triumphant glint appeared in his eyes. He decided, in that moment of supreme hubris, to make his victory absolute. He would not just defeat the boy, he would humiliate him in front of his peers. "You know," Sterling said, departing from his prepared remarks, "as I look out at this community, I see progress. I see the future. But progress always has its challenges. There are always those who want to cling to the past, people who would rather polish rust than plant seeds." He didn't need to say Wyatt's name. Every person in that tent knew who he was talking about. "There are people who live in a world of sentiment and nostalgia," Sterling continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "They think there's some kind of magic in old, broken-down equipment. I was at an auction about a year ago, and I saw a young fellow, some of you may have been there, who paid $50 for a tractor that was barely worth its weight in scrap, just a pile of rust." He paused, letting the story sink in. He looked directly at Wyatt. "I even offered to buy it from him for a handsome profit, but he wouldn't sell. He had some idea, some sentimental attachment." Sterling laughed, a short, sharp bark. "And I told him then what I'll tell all of you now." He leaned into the microphone, his voice becoming a sharp, declarative statement. "You can't build a future on sentiment. It's a hard lesson for some to learn. You have to leave the real business to the men who understand it." The insult, The exact same one he had used at the auction hung in the air. This was the climax of his performance, but he wasn't done. He decided to turn the screw one last time, to make his legal position brutally clear. This was his final aggressive move. "And speaking of the future," he boomed, "I'm proud to announce that as of yesterday, Agricorp has finalized the acquisition of the final parcels of the old Hemlock property. We now control the entire 2,000-acre tract from the river to the ridge. And as a gesture of our commitment to cleaning up this beautiful valley, we will be undertaking a full reclamation of the land. All abandoned structures will be demolished, and all derelict equipment left on any of those properties will be cleared and disposed of." He looked directly at Wyatt again, a final, triumphant smirk on his face. He was laying claim to everything. He was telling Wyatt and the world that even if the tractor held some small secret tied to the land, it was irrelevant now. The land was his. Anything on it was his. Anything on it. He had his top lawyer standing just off stage, who gave a confident nod. Sterling thought he had closed every possible loophole. He thought he had won. A silence fell over the crowd. The public challenge, the utter humiliation, was complete. Everyone looked at Wyatt, expecting him to slink away in defeat. But Wyatt didn't move. He just stood there, his face calm. Then he began to walk forward. He walked slowly, deliberately, through the crowd, which parted for him like the Red Sea. He walked all the way to the foot of the stage. He didn't look angry. He looked calm, resolved. He stopped and looked up at Sterling. He didn't ask for the microphone. He spoke in his own quiet voice, but it carried with an unnatural clarity in the tense silence. "You're right about a few things, Mr. Sterling," Wyatt began. "It is a business, and you do have to understand it." He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out the folded year-old receipt from the auction. He held it up. "I bought the tractor, paid $50 for it, fair and square. Here's the receipt. It's my property." He paused, then added, "And it hasn't been on any of your new land for over a year. It's been in my garage the whole time." A confused murmur went through the crowd. Sterling's smile faltered. This wasn't how the script was supposed to go. Wyatt then turned his head slightly, looking toward a man who had been standing quietly off to the side, unnoticed by almost everyone. The man was in his late 50s, with a neatly trimmed gray beard and a quiet, professional demeanor. He wore a simple windbreaker with a small, official-looking patch on the sleeve. "This is Mr. Abernathy," Wyatt said, his voice steady and clear. "He's a senior adjudicator from the State Bureau of Land Management. He was kind enough to come out today to verify a claim." Wyatt then reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small stack of papers held together by a binder clip. On top was the certified copy of the 1974 quitclaim deed. According to this deed, filed on October 17, 1974, by John Hemlock, Wyatt announced, his voice ringing with authority, "the subsurface mineral rights for the entire 2,000-acre tract you just finished buying were legally severed from the surface rights." Sterling's lawyer, a man named Davis, started to move forward, a dismissive look on his face. "That's a standard severance," he said loudly. "It's meaningless unless your client owns the rights, which he does not." Wyatt ignored him and continued, his eyes locked on Sterling. "The deed further specifies that the mineral rights were to be legally defined not as real property, but as personal chattel." He held up the auction receipt again. "And that ownership of this chattel was to be permanently and inseparably affixed to one specific piece of property, a 1948 Farmall Model H tractor, serial number FBH-278841. He let the serial number hang in the air for a beat. "The tractor I bought at auction last year for $50. A wave of shocked understanding began to ripple through the crowd. Sterling's face had gone pale. His lawyer, Davis, was frozen in place, his mouth slightly agape. Mr. Abernathy, the neutral authority, took one step forward. He did not look at Wyatt. He looked directly at Sterling and his lawyer. His voice was calm, bureaucratic, and utterly devastating. He spoke one simple, world-changing sentence. "The boy is right," he said. "We've reviewed the original conveyance, the chain of title for the chattel, and the bill of sale for the tractor. Our legal department confirms it. According to the laws of this state, your company, AgriCorp, owns the dirt. He owns the oil and gas underneath it. Silence. It was not a normal silence. It was a physical thing, a vacuum that sucked the air out of the tent. The sizzle of the barbecue, the distant hum of a generator, the very breathing of the 100 people present, it all vanished. It was a silence made of 100 minds, simultaneously processing an impossible truth. It was the sound of a world turning upside down. Sterling stood on the stage, his face the color of ash. His practiced smile was gone, replaced by a mask of slack-jawed horror. Davis, his lawyer, was frantically shuffling through a briefcase, his hands trembling, searching for a document, an argument, anything to refute the catastrophic reality that had just landed on them. The banner behind Sterling, sowing the seeds of tomorrow's harvest, now seemed like a cruel, ironic joke. The first person to move was Bill Jensen. He walked from his place beside Wyatt and stood in front of him, turning his back to the stage. He reached out and shook Wyatt's hand. Then another farmer, an old man who had been one of his grandfather's closest friends, did the same. And then another, and another. A line formed. The farmers of the Red River Valley, the men who had been courted and condescended to by Sterling, were turning their backs on him one by one. They were leaving his party. They were abandoning his tent. They were walking out of his world and into Wyatt's. They formed a silent, solid wall of support around the young man and his quiet, earth-shattering victory. As the crowd filed out, leaving the tent nearly empty, Bob Henderson, the auctioneer, who had been standing by his podium in stunned silence, leaned into the still live microphone. He looked at the wreckage of Sterling's ambition, at the man standing alone on the stage amidst the wilting floral arrangements. "Well," Henderson's gravelly voice echoed through the empty tent, a fitting epitaph for Sterling's career. "I guess some folks just don't understand the real business after all." The fallout was swift and brutal. AgriCorp, faced with the reality that their multi-million-dollar land acquisition was now essentially worthless without the mineral rights, tried to fight. They threw a team of high-priced lawyers at the problem, filing lawsuits and injunctions. They claimed the original conveyance was invalid, that it was an unconscionable contract. But Wyatt's case, built so patiently on the foundation of his grandfather's wisdom, was a fortress. The certified deed, the unbroken chain of title, the tax records, and the final devastating proof, the original document itself, which Wyatt had a bonded locksmith carefully extract from the tractor's frame, was unassailable. Worse for AgriCorp, a geological survey that Sterling himself had commissioned before buying the land, a survey he had kept secret, was subpoenaed. It revealed that the Hemlock Tract sat atop one of the richest shale oil and natural gas deposits in the state. The mineral rights weren't just valuable. They were a king's ransom, worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Sterling's attempt to buy the tractor for $1,000 was presented in court as proof that he suspected its value, making his company's position even worse. The corporation, facing a financial catastrophe and a public relations nightmare, capitulated. Clark Sterling was fired, his career and reputation destroyed in a single afternoon. His name became a cautionary tale in the valley, a synonym for arrogant foolishness. To cover its losses, AgriCorp was forced to liquidate its holdings in the region. They had to sell the 2,000-acre Hemlock Tract, piece by piece, back to the very same local farm families they had pushed out, often at a significant loss. During the settlement negotiations, AgriCorp's lawyers made a final desperate plea for mercy, begging Wyatt not to sue for punitive damages that would bankrupt the regional division entirely. They expected him to be ruthless. They had, after all, tried to ruin him. But Wyatt was his grandfather's grandson. He saw an opportunity not for revenge, but for restoration. He made them an offer. He would waive all claims for damages. In return, AgriCorp had to do two things. First, they had to establish a multi-million-dollar agricultural scholarship fund administered by the local community college to help young people in the valley start their own farms. Second, they had to forgive the outstanding mortgage debt on 5 specific local families they had been squeezing, including the family that now lived on and worked Samuel Carver's original farm. Wyatt didn't take their money. He used his power to heal the wounds they had inflicted on his community. It was a gesture of compassion so profound, so unexpected, that it cemented his status as a local legend. He had not only won, he had won with grace. Wyatt Carver did not become an oil baron. He sold a portion of the mineral rights to a responsible energy company, securing his financial future. But he placed the majority of them into a community land trust. The trust's purpose was to buy up farmland that came for sale and lease it back to young farming families at affordable rates, ensuring that the land would be worked by people who loved it, not by corporations that only valued it. His own life did not change dramatically. He bought his grandfather's old farm back, restoring the house and the workshop to their former glory. The workshop, however, became something more. It became a school. He expanded it, not into a factory, but into a place where the valley's youth could come to learn the old ways. He taught them how to read a spark plug, how to use a micrometer, how to listen to the metal. He kept his hands greasy. His business, Carver Repair, thrived, his reputation for integrity more valuable than any amount of advertising. The final scene of the story unfolded on a crisp autumn afternoon about 10 years later. Wyatt, now in his early 30s, his face beginning to show the first lines of a life well lived, was in the workshop, meticulously rebuilding the engine of the old Farmall H. He had restored it completely, its red paint gleaming under the lights. It was not a trophy. It was a reminder. The door to the workshop creaked open. A young man, maybe 16 or 17, stood silhouetted in the doorway. He was lanky and awkward, with a shock of unruly hair and a look of intense, nervous earnestness on his face. He was clutching a small, new notebook to his chest like a shield. "Mr. Carver?" the boy asked, his voice cracking slightly. Wyatt smiled, wiping his hands on a clean rag. He saw a ghost in the doorway. He saw himself. "That's me," Wyatt said. "What can I do for you?" I have a question," the boy stammered, stepping into the shop. "It's about the final drive on a John Deere Model B. The parts diagram says the pinion gear should have 19 teeth, but the one I pulled out of my grandpa's old tractor only has 18. I can't figure out why. I've been reading about it all week." Wyatt's smile widened. The boy had done his research. He wasn't just asking for an answer, he was asking for understanding. He was starting at the right place. Wyatt walked over to the sturdy shelf on the wall and pulled down a thick black binder. The label on the spine, written in his grandfather's faded ink, read, "John Deere B." He blew a thin layer of dust from the top and laid it open on the workbench. The pages were yellowed and soft with age. "Let's take a look together," Wyatt said, his voice the same low, patient rumble that his grandfather's had been. He beckoned the boy closer. "The book will give us the factory specs, but the metal will tell us the truth." Sterling, in his arrogance, had looked at a field of dirt and calculated its price. Wyatt, armed with the wisdom of his grandfather, had looked at the same field but had taken the time to learn its story. He understood that true value is rarely found on the surface. It is often hidden, welded into the very frame of things, waiting for a patient hand and a knowing eye. It is passed down not in bank accounts, but in the quiet transmission of knowledge from one generation to the next. Knowledge, once welded to principle, can never be scrapped.